Lieutenant Joseph Burkett could not see the men he was supposed to lead up the hill. The fog on the eastern shoulder of the ridge was thick enough that a soldier standing 15 feet away was a shape rather than a man. Burkett had 22 of them, and 16 had joined the company within the previous 2 days. He did not know their names. He did not know which of them could shoot. He knew only that above him, somewhere in that grey, wet nothing, was a line of log and earth bunkers that had already absorbed more artillery than any position of comparable size in the war so far, and had not been meaningfully damaged by any of it. In his hand he carried a small portable radio. It was the only thing connecting him to the supporting weapons behind him, and to the artillery observers who could not see the ground he was about to cross, because the fog had closed over the entire ridgeline before first light. The air smelled of burnt pine and wet ash. The monsoon rain of the past 3 weeks had turned the fighting positions into soup, and the shelling had stripped every tree on the ridge down to splinters and stumps, so that air observers looking down at the objective reported that the hills appeared to have been ploughed. There was nothing left up there to hide behind. There was also nothing left up there to identify. The men climbing had no landmarks. They had a compass bearing and the sound of their own breathing. It was August 31st, 1951. The hill in front of Burkett was marked on the maps as Hill 773, the eastern peak of a ridge that ran east to west above the Punchbowl basin in the mountains of east-central Korea. The United Nations forward positions were roughly 2 miles away. The North Korean soldiers waiting on the reverse slope above him had held that ridge against everything sent at it for 13 straight days. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for something small. Cold War Impact is an independent channel, and videos like this one take weeks of work in official histories, unit command reports, and archive material before a single line gets written. Recently our reach has been falling, and the only thing that reliably fixes that is you. If you find this kind of history worth making, please subscribe, drop a comment, and share the video with someone who would appreciate it. It genuinely decides whether the next documentary gets made. Now, back to the ridge. By August of 1951, the Korean War had stopped moving. The first year had been a war of enormous distances, of armies chasing each other from the Naktung to the Yalu and back again. That war was over. What replaced it was a line running roughly east to west across the peninsula near the 38th parallel, and a set of negotiations at Kaesong that had opened on July 10, 1951, and had almost immediately curdled into a stalemate of their own. Neither side intended to win the war outright anymore. Both intended to improve the ground they would be standing on when the shooting finally stopped. That is the specific and rather unglamorous reason men died on Bloody Ridge. It was not a breakthrough operation. It was not part of a drive on Pyongyang. It was a limited objective attack, the tactical vocabulary of the period, meant to take high ground from which North Korean observers could see down onto United Nations positions and a supply road. The soldiers doing it were not told that the front line would barely move again for the remaining 2 years of the war. They were told to take the hill. And for 19 days, the hill did not fall. Everything the United States Army possessed in the way of firepower was applied to that ridge. Divisional howitzers, corps-level heavy artillery, heavy mortar companies, tanks firing direct from the valley floor, fighter bombers with high explosive and with napalm. The ridge was shelled until the vegetation was gone, then shelled again once there was nothing left to burn. And every time the infantry climbed to the crest, the same thing happened. Men came up out of the ground on the far side of the hill and killed them. The most quoted number attached to this battle is 14,425 artillery rounds fired in 1 day. That figure is real, it is attached to this battle, and later in this video I'm going to tell you exactly where it comes from, and exactly why the best modern scholar working on this campaign does not trust the claim built around it. But the number is not the story. The story is what all of that steel failed to do. Because the thing that finally broke the North Korean hold on Bloody Ridge was not a new weapon, and it was not a heavier gun brought up from corps, and it was not, in the end, the volume of fire at all. It was a change of method. It was a corps commander who stopped attacking one ridge and started squeezing an entire front, and a division that finally committed every regiment it had to a movement around both ends of the hill rather than another climb up the middle, and 19 days of losses that the men holding the crest could no longer replace. And the most uncomfortable part of the story is what happened next. Because 8 days after Bloody Ridge fell, The same American division attacked the next ridge north the same way it had attacked this one and spent a month learning the identical lesson a second time. To understand any of it, we have to go back to the middle of August 1951 and to a general who believed with real conviction and considerable evidence behind him that American firepower could be substituted for American lives. General James Van Fleet had taken command of the 8th Army in April of 1951 when General Matthew Ridgway moved up to replace General Douglas MacArthur as United Nations commander. Van Fleet arrived with a settled conviction that ammunition was cheaper than men and that his army should act accordingly. It was not a slogan, it was a resourcing decision, and it became known throughout the theatre as the Van Fleet Rate, or the Van Fleet Load, an authorised expenditure running at something like 5 times the normal allowance. He had reason to believe in it. In May of 1951, on the Soyang River, Chinese and North Korean formations attacked into concentrated American artillery and were slaughtered. On May 22 alone, 10th Corps fired 49,986 rounds. Across the whole of that battle, from the second week of May into the first week of June, expenditure ran past 644,000 rounds, something on the order of 18,000 tons of ammunition. Gunners were firing about 250 rounds per gun per day, and it was that figure, more than any other, that gave the Van Fleet Rate its name. The enemy offensive collapsed. To Van Fleet, the lesson was obvious, and the arithmetic was moral. Every shell fired was a rifleman who did not have to walk into a machine gun. The problem was that the Soyang River had been a defensive battle against troops advancing in the open. Bloody Ridge would be the opposite in every particular. It would be an attack uphill against men who were not moving, who were underground, and who had spent weeks preparing for precisely the bombardment that was about to arrive. On August 14, 1951, Van Fleet gave his instruction to the commander of 10th Corps, Major General Clovis Byers. Capture Hill 983 at an early date, using Republic of Korea forces in the principal effort, supported by American firepower. That second clause mattered as much as the first. Van Fleet had become convinced that South Korean divisions lacked confidence in themselves, that they had spent too much of the war on the defensive, and that the only cure was to hand them a hard objective with American guns behind them. It was a defensible theory. It was about to be tested on the worst possible piece of ground in Korea. The terrain is worth understanding properly because almost everything that followed was dictated by it. North of the Punchbowl, the bowl-shaped basin that American correspondents had named for its shape, the Taebaek Mountains rise in a series of steep ridges, separated by narrow valleys. Bloody Ridge was one of those ridges running east to west, and it formed the crossbar of a hill mass shaped roughly like the letter H, about 2 miles north of the 2nd Infantry Division's forward positions. There were 3 high points along it. Hill 983 at the western end, the highest of the 3. Hill 940 in the centre, about 1,100 yards to the east. Hill 773 another 1,000 yards further east again. 4 razor-backed spurs converged on Hill 983. That is not a decorative detail. It meant an attacking force had almost no choice about its approach. You went up a spur in single file or something close to it, exposed on both flanks, into ground the defenders had ranged weeks earlier. There was no manoeuvre space on those slopes and no way to bring numbers to bear. A battalion attacking up a razorback fights as a squad because a squad is all that can reach the top of the ridge at any given moment. At the eastern end, beyond Hill 773, the ground dropped away to a road pass between the village of Woronni and a valley called Piari. Hold on to that geography. Nobody studying the operational maps in the 3rd week of August was thinking about it, and by the 1st week of September, it was the most important ground on the map. The men holding all of this were soldiers of the Korean People's Army, and here I have to be honest with you about the limits of the record, because I think the honesty is more interesting than a confident invention would be. We do not know who commanded them, not by name. The best scholarship available establishes that the defense of Bloody Ridge was conducted by 2 regiments drawn from 2 different divisions of the North Korean 2nd Corps. That is the level of precision the sources support. You will find confident claims naming specific North Korean divisions at Bloody Ridge, and most of those numbered units genuinely were in that part of the front, but they are documented at Heartbreak Ridge, the battle that followed, not at this one. You will also find sources describing the defenders as Chinese. They were not. Chinese formations appear in this sector later. At Heartbreak, Bloody Ridge was held by North Koreans, and in the surviving Western record, they are anonymous. What we know instead is what they built. and what they built tells you more about them than a name would. North Korean field engineering by the summer of 1951 had become the most sophisticated of any army in the theatre, and it had become that way through a brutally efficient teaching method. They had spent a year being bombed and shelled by an enemy with total air superiority and enormous quantities of ammunition. Everything that did not survive that experience had been discarded. Everything that did survive had been standardized. The core of the system was the reverse slope. Instead of digging on the forward face of a hill where an attacker can see you and where observed artillery fire can reach you directly, they dug behind the crest line on the slope falling away from the enemy. Artillery firing at a reverse slope has to drop shells almost vertically to touch it, and howitzers, even at high angle, struggle to do that with the precision required. A bombardment could therefore obliterate the forward face of a hill, remove every tree, collapse every visible trench, and leave the actual garrison sitting intact, 50 yards over the top, waiting. The bunkers themselves were built from heavy timber and rock, roofed with layered logs and packed earth, and the official American account describes them as strong enough to withstand artillery fire and airstrikes. Some were large enough to shelter as many as 60 men. Some housed mortars or small artillery pieces firing through embrasures. They were connected by trench systems, so a position that had been cleared could be reoccupied from underground within minutes, and the trench network was extensive enough that it was what made the ridge look from the air as though it had been turned over by a plough. In front of them lay minefields. And here I want to be careful, because there is a detail that gets attached to this battle which belongs to the wider war. North Korean units in this period used mines built into wooden boxes rather than metal casings, specifically so that American mine detectors, which worked by sensing metal, would sweep over them and register nothing. That practice is well documented across the Korean War. Whether every minefield on this particular ridge was laid that way is not something the Bloody Ridge sources establish, so treat it as the general engineering habit of the army defending the hill rather than a proven feature of these slopes. The confidence of the men inside that system rested on one assumption, and the previous year of war had earned them it. It was that the Americans would come at them from the front. Every attack up to that point had. Armies that possess overwhelming firepower develop a habit of using it in the most direct way available. The North Koreans had built a position close to invulnerable to a frontal attack supported by massive bombardment, because a frontal attack supported by massive bombardment was exactly what they expected to receive. For 18 days, that is exactly what they received. The instrument the 8th Army intended to use was, on paper, magnificent. Supporting the attack were the 4 organic field artillery battalions of the 2nd Infantry Division, reinforced with 2 medium battalions firing 155mm howitzers, an additional light battalion firing 105mm howitzers, 2 heavy mortar companies, 2 regimental tank companies, and a medium tank company, the whole of it coordinated by 2nd Division artillery. Behind that sat corps-level guns, including 8-inch howitzers and the long-barreled 155mm guns that the crews called Long Toms. The distinction between those weapons is the single most important technical fact in this story, so it is worth 2 minutes. A howitzer fires on a curved trajectory. It lobs a shell up and over, which is what you want when you're shooting at something behind a hill, and it is what makes the howitzer the backbone of any army fighting in mountains. The 105mm howitzer was the standard American light piece, quick to lay, quick to fire, and available in enormous numbers. The 155mm howitzer threw a much heavier shell along the same kind of arc. The Long Tom was different. It was a gun rather than a howitzer, with a longer barrel and a much flatter, faster trajectory, and that flat trajectory made it the single most effective bunker-killing weapon available in Korea. A shell arriving nearly horizontally at high velocity strikes the front face of a bunker and goes into it. A shell arriving at a steep angle strikes the roof, which is precisely the surface the North Koreans had layered with logs and packed earth to defeat that kind of impact. The American official history is blunt about the consequence. Against bunkers of this construction, generally only a direct hit from the heaviest caliber artillery would destroy them, and the most effective weapon against them was the Long Tom. It then adds the sentence that decides the battle. There were relatively few Long Toms available, and they could not always be placed in position for direct, low-trajectory fire. So the army possessed the answer to the bunker problem. It had it in the theatre, in service, crewed and supplied. It simply could not get enough of them into the right places. Long toms were core assets. There were never many, and they were heavy. Getting one into a firing position on a Korean mountain, in monsoon season, on a road network built for ox carts, was an engineering project rather than a movement order. What could be brought to bear, in effectively unlimited quantity, was the one category of weapon least suited to the target. Curved trajectory fire in colossal volume against roofs designed to survive it. The soldiers on the ground understood this better than the fire plans did, and they improvised accordingly. Tanks were brought forward and used as direct fire weapons, which is not what a medium tank is designed for and is exactly what it is useful for in mountains. In the first days of September, a tank and a half-track mounting 4 heavy machine guns were positioned on the road near Warren Knee and fired straight across at Hill 940. A tank sitting on a valley floor, firing horizontally at a bunker embrasure across the way, is doing in miniature what a long tom does, and there were more tanks than long toms. The limitation was that a tank can only shoot at what it can see, and a reverse slope bunker by definition cannot be seen from the attacking side of the hill. Recoilless rifles were carried up the spurs by hand for the same reason, to put a flat trajectory shell into an embrasure at close range. Demolition charges were carried up alongside them. Flamethrowers were used at the end because a flamethrower does not need to breach a bunker roof. It needs a firing slit and a man willing to walk to within a few yards of it. On Hill 7731, flamethrower had its pressure tank pierced before it could be used, and 2 operators emptied burning jelly over the crest onto the reverse slope simply to put fire where the shells could not reach. Air support delivered napalm, which was the most effective thing that could be dropped on that terrain because burning fuel flows into trenches and ventilation openings in a way fragmentation does not. On September 3, 4 fighters put 8 napalm bombs onto the objective, one of them striking the crest, and followed with 8 anti-personnel bombs fitted with proximity fuses onto the reverse slope, and then strafed it. Every one of those methods worked. None of them could be applied at scale. They were craftsmen's tools being used against an industrial problem, and the industrial tool, the mass of howitzers, was the one thing that could be applied at scale and the one thing that could not reach the target. This is where the modern historiography turns critical, and it is not gentle. Colonel Brian Gibby, whose study of the 2nd Division around the Punchbowl is the sharpest analytical account we have, argues that the division leaned on what gunners call destruction missions, the attempt to physically demolish enemy positions by sustained fire, and that these missions rarely produced useful effects. Meanwhile, the 2 categories of fire that might have changed things faster were comparatively neglected. Counter-battery work, meaning shooting at the enemy's guns rather than at his infantry, and interdiction, meaning shooting at the tracks and valleys by which he was fed. Gibby's conclusion is that firepower on its own was insufficient, and the record of those 19 days is the evidence for it. The logistics of trying to prove otherwise are worth pausing on because the scale is hard to picture. 10th Corps committed something in the region of 132.5-ton trucks to hauling artillery ammunition, moving an average of 32,000 shells a day forward over a road network with barely 1,200 tons of rated capacity. A single 105mm round, boxed and fused, weighs on the order of 50 pounds. The rounds move from the ports by rail and truck to divisional dumps, then onto smaller vehicles, and on the final stretch, on ground, no vehicle could climb, onto the backs of men. Those men were the Korean Service Corps, the organization American soldiers knew as the A-frame army, after the wooden carrying frame the Koreans called a chij. Some veterans called the porters chiggy bears, a soldier's corruption of the same word rather than any official term. They were largely older Korean civilians in labor units, and they carried ammunition, water, rations and signal wire up mountainsides with no roads, and they carried the wounded back down. Every mortar bomb fired from that ridge, every belt of machine gun ammunition, every canteen of water in a place with no water arrived on somebody's back. The infantry did the same. Before a rifleman reached his line of departure, he had usually already hauled a mortar round or a recoilless rifle round up the hill for somebody else, and then he attacked. The attack opened on August 18, 1951, after days of preparatory bombardment. The unit chosen for the main effort was the 36th Regiment of the Republic of Korea 5th Division, attached for the operation to the American 2nd Infantry Division. Its battalions went for the 3 peaks and ran into mines and observed artillery almost at once on ground that had been surveyed by the defenders weeks earlier. The pattern of the first week established itself immediately and then repeated with a mechanical, awful regularity. bombard, climb, reach the crest or nearly reach it, meet men coming up out of the reverse slope with grenades and automatic weapons, fall back down the spur, bombard again. The Republic of Korea troops took Hill 773 on the night of August 19. They were driven off Hill 940. They came back. On August 25, after a week of it, they took the ridge. On August 26, the North Koreans counterattacked and took it back. On August 27th, the 36th Regiment broke. That is the plainest way to say it, and I am not going to dress it up, because the reason is important and it is not cowardice. The regiment had taken more than 1,000 casualties in 10 days, roughly a quarter of them killed or missing. It had captured its objective and lost it again in a single night. Its men had been asked to walk up the same 4 spurs into the same guns, more times than any unit can be asked to do that. On the 27th, elements gave way and the collapse spread sideways into the American 9th Infantry Regiment alongside them. Van Fleet had wanted South Korean troops blooded in the attack. They had been. The experiment had produced a regiment that was combat ineffective and an objective still in enemy hands. The 9th Infantry Regiment took over. The Manchus, a regiment carrying a nickname earned in China at the turn of the century, commanded by Colonel John Lynch. Its 2nd Battalion attacked Hill 983, failed and withdrew toward Woronne. Its 3rd Battalion attacked from the east toward Hill 773 on August 28th, could not reach the crest, and was pushed back by a night counterattack off the ground it had taken. The pressure on Lynch was considerable, and it very nearly ended his command. The division commander, Major General Clark Ruffner, was ready to relieve him over the regiment's slow progress, and was talked out of it by his assistant division commander, Brigadier General Hayden Boatner. It is a small episode, and it tells you a great deal about the atmosphere at divisional headquarters in the last week of August. The men on the spurs were failing because the spurs could not be climbed under that fire. The men above them were looking for someone to hold responsible. On August 30, the regiment tried the most direct thing available. 2 battalions, 1st and 2nd, attacking Hill 940, frontally, side by side. Both got within a few hundred yards of the crest. Neither got further. Company A was cut to roughly half strength and its officers were killed or wounded in succession. Lieutenant John Dunn took over the company and was then killed himself. Command passed to the artillery forward observer attached to it, Lieutenant Edwin Morrow, whose job was to direct fire and nothing else, and who found himself running an infantry company on a hillside. The thought that went through his head as it happened has survived, because he told it to an army historian afterwards. This, he thought, is the fastest transfer of an artillery officer to the infantry that I have ever seen. Getting the survivors off that slope took 7 artillery battalions firing a smoke mission at once. Building a wall the North Korean gunners could not see through, while the remaining infantrymen carried their wounded down the hill they had failed to take. It was around this point that the battle acquired its name. The American service newspaper Stars and Stripes ran the story and called the place Bloody Ridge. For security reasons, the paper did not clearly identify the locations, which produced a small, bleak absurdity that men of the 9th Infantry remembered for the rest of their lives. Soldiers came off the ridge, read about a terrible battle somewhere called Bloody Ridge, and wondered what sector it was in. Which brings us back to Lieutenant Burkett in the fog. His platoon belonged to Company B of the 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Gaylord Bishop, and it had been fed into the attack on Hill 773 from the east, after Company C stalled in front of it. What happened to him on August 31st is the clearest single illustration in the whole battle of why the firepower theory failed, because almost nothing that stopped him was inflicted by the enemy. The fog came first. It closed over the ridge before the attack and did something that sounds minor and was catastrophic. It blinded the artillery, not the guns, the observers. Indirect fire in 1951 depended on a human being who could see the target and the fall of shot and adjust one against the other, by voice. With the ridge under cloud, the observers could not see the crest, could not see the bunkers, could not see where the rounds were landing, and could not correct them. The mortars were in the same position. Burkett went up the hill with the theoretical support of the most concentrated artillery park on the Korean Peninsula and with no practical support at all. Then his radio failed. Not destroyed. It simply stopped working, a handheld set in wet mountain air, and with it went his only link to the weapons that were supposed to be suppressing the bunkers ahead of him while he closed. At one point he leaned back so far to throw a grenade that his helmet fell off. 16 of his 22 men had been in the company for less than 48 hours. Captain Edward Krzyzowski, commanding Company B, sent forward what help he could, including an automatic rifleman named Domingo Trujillo. Trujillo got close enough to a bunker to fire into it, and to do that, he had to stand upright because there was no angle from the ground. He put one burst through the embrasure. The burst that came back struck him in the neck and chest and killed him instantly. The judgment written afterwards by the Army's own combat historian, Russell Googler, who walked that ground and interviewed the survivors, is one of the least sentimental passages in American military literature, and it is worth hearing in his own words. None can deny, he wrote, that the men of the 1st Battalion, 9th Infantry, fought, bled, and died gallantly on Bloody Ridge. But who will testify that the battalion, its companies, its platoons, its squads, were teams when they went into action on Hill 773? Replacements cannot be fitted into a unit in 2 hours. That is the false start in this story. Not a defeat inflicted by superior soldiers. A defeat inflicted by weather, by a dead radio, and by a replacement system that pushed men into rifle companies as individuals rather than as units, on the morning they were needed most. By the end of August, the situation had become genuinely serious, and not only on the ridge. On August 23rd, the armistice negotiations at Kaesong were suspended outright. The talks that were the entire strategic justification for fighting a limited objective battle had stopped. The men dying on the spurs of Hill 940 were now dying for a bargaining position in a negotiation that was not, at that moment, taking place. The weather worsened. The monsoon was in its heaviest phase, and it did 3 things at once. It grounded the fighter bombers, removing the only asset that could reliably put fire onto a reverse slope. It blinded the observers, removing the artillery's precision. And it broke down the roads so that the ammunition columns were working on surfaces that dissolved under the weight of the trucks moving over them. It was in this period that Major General Byers at 10th Corps made the decision that changed the battle. It is not a dramatic decision, and it appears in almost no short account of Bloody Ridge, and it is the hinge on which the whole thing turns. He stopped attacking Bloody Ridge on its own. Instead of continuing to hammer one ridge with one division, he widened the pressure across the entire corps front. The Republic of Korea 5th Division moved against the northwestern rim of the Punchbowl. The 1st Marine Division went at the northeastern rim. The Republic of Korea 7th Division applied pressure west of Bloody Ridge itself. The logic was that of a man pulling on a net rather than punching a wall. If the North Korean command had to defend everywhere, it could not concentrate its artillery and its reserves on the one hill that mattered. It also changed what the geography meant. As long as the fighting was confined to the ridge, the valley behind the ridge was a rear area. Once the front widened, that valley became a flank. Now, before the last week of this battle, I want to lay out plainly what the tactical problem actually was in both directions. What the United Nations forces could do was deliver more explosive onto a given piece of ground than any army in history had delivered up to that point. They could strip a hillside bare, cut communications wire, destroy exposed weapons, kill anyone caught above ground, and dominate the air completely. What they could not do was kill a man inside a log and earth bunker on a reverse slope with a curved trajectory shell. Every other difficulty in this battle was a consequence of that one. The bombardment did not destroy the garrison. It suppressed the garrison temporarily, and suppression ends the moment the guns lift. The guns had to lift because the infantry was climbing the ground the shells were landing on. There was always a gap of a minute or two between the last round and the first American soldier reaching the crest, and that gap was the entire North Korean defensive plan. It was long enough for men to come up out of a bunker and reach a firing position with grenades. What the North Koreans could do was hold that ground more or less indefinitely against frontal attack. What they could not do was replace what they were losing while doing it, or manufacture food, water and ammunition on top of a mountain. Everything they consumed came up the valleys behind the ridge at night on the backs of men and animals, and a defensive system built entirely underground has an enormous appetite for resupply and very little capacity to store. So the conditions for ending the battle were these, and they were not the conditions the fire plans had been written for. The attacking force had to keep the garrison fixed on the ridge so that it could not be thinned out. It had to widen the front far enough that the North Korean command could not reinforce this one hill freely. It had to commit enough infantry across enough of the hill mass at once that the defenders were fighting in several directions rather than one, and it had to keep doing all of that long enough for losses that could not be replaced to become losses that could not be sustained. None of those conditions involved destroying a bunker. The man who assembled them into a final plan was, by the time it mattered, the division artillery commander, and there is an irony in that which is worth stating carefully. Command of the 2nd Infantry Division changed hands in the middle of this battle. Major General Clark Ruffner commanded the division through the whole of August, including the first 2 weeks on the ridge. On September 1, 1951, Brigadier General Thomas DeShazo, the division artillery commander, assumed command pending the arrival of a permanent replacement, and it was DeShazo who was in command for the final and decisive days. Major General Robert Young did not take over until September the 20th, by which time this battle was finished and the next one had started. And on taking command, DeShazo stated that his predecessor's policy would continue. Artillery rather than infantry would be used to secure positions. He then, within days, presided over the operation that did the opposite. Working with Byers, he committed all 3 of the division's infantry regiments. The 9th continued to press the ridge frontally, holding the garrison in place. The 23rd and the 38th moved around both ends of the hill mass in a double envelopment, and the eastern arm of that movement went for the high ground above the road pass at Warren Knee, beyond which lay the Pierre Valley and the tracks that fed the ridge. The last days of Bloody Ridge from September 1 to September 5 are the days in which the 14,000 shell figure belongs. So let us deal with it properly, because I promised I would. The claim is that the 15th Field Artillery Battalion, a 105mm howitzer battalion of the 2nd Infantry Division, fired 14,425 rounds in a single 24-hour period during this battle. That is a battalion figure, not a division figure, and not a corps figure. A 105mm battalion of that period fielded 18 howitzers in 3 batteries of 6, spread across 18 tubes. That is roughly 800 rounds per gun in a day. It is a rate that wrecks barrel life and exhausts crews to the point of collapse, and it represents something like 360 tons of ammunition delivered to the gun positions by truck on those roads, in that weather, for one battalion. The reason the figure is stated so confidently in so many places is that it originates with the battalion itself in its own records, presented as an attempt to set a new expenditure record for light artillery battalions. Colonel Gibby, citing it, describes that effort as dubious. He does not say the guns were quiet. He says the boast should not be treated as an audited fact. No source attaches a calendar date to it, and no corps' ammunition return has been produced that confirms it. I am telling you this because the honest version is more interesting than the clean one. Somewhere in the first days of September 1951, 18 American howitzers on a Korean mountainside fired an almost unbelievable quantity of ammunition at a hill, and the men who did it were proud enough of that to write it into their unit's permanent record. And it is entirely possible the number is precise, and entirely possible. It grew a little in the telling, and the ridge did not fall because of it either way. What was happening while those guns fired was an infantry fight of a kind artillery cannot settle. On the eastern end of the ridge, the 1st Battalion of the 9th Infantry was working through the bunker system at a range measured in feet. This was not an assault in any recognizable sense. It was a sequence of individual bunker reductions, each requiring a group of men to get close enough to put a flamethrower or a demolition charge or a satchel of grenades into an embrasure, while the bunkers on either side fired at them. Captain Edward Krzyzowski was in the middle of it across those 4 days, and his Medal of Honor citation records their shape as plainly as anything written since. It refers to the objective as Hill 700, which is the designation used in the citation for the action near the village of Tondul rather than a separate feature somewhere else, and that is worth saying out loud because the discrepancy confuses people who go looking. He crept up a fire-swept slope and destroyed 1 bunker with grenades and a second with carbine fire. His company was forced back for the night, and he attacked again the following day, gaining several hundred yards. When the company was overwhelmed, he ordered his men to evacuate the wounded and pull back, covered their withdrawal himself, was hit by grenade fragments, and refused evacuation. On September the 3rd, he led one more assault, and when it was pinned down, he walked forward alone onto an open knoll to get a view good enough to plot mortar concentrations onto the position, and a sniper killed him where he stood. The same day, Company C of that battalion, which had begun the fighting with something like 85 men, ended it with about 30. To the east, the envelopment was moving. By September 4, the 23rd and 38th Regiments had pushed around the flanks, and the eastern arm had reached ground from which the road pass and the approaches beyond it could be observed and shot at. On the night of September 4 to September 5, 1951, the North Korean garrison left. Not in a rout and not under assault. They withdrew in good order in the dark off a position they had held successfully for 19 days. When American troops moved up the following morning, they advanced, in the phrasing of the official account, with surprising ease because there was nobody there. They found the bunker system largely intact. They found supplies abandoned in place. They found more than 500 North Korean dead, left where they had fallen or stacked, because the withdrawal had been quick enough that burial was not an option. They had gone about 1,500 yards, barely 3/4 of a mile, north to the next ridge. That ridge did not have a name yet. Now, why did they go? This matters, and it is the point at which a lot of popular accounts of this battle overreach, so I want to give you what the official histories actually say, rather than the tidier version. They do not say the supply route was cut and the position starved. They say the North Koreans conceded the ridge only after the attack had been broadened to apply pressure at several points along the corps front, only after the 2nd Division had committed elements of all 3 of its regiments, and only after suffering severe casualties. Weakened by heavy losses, they finally evacuated. The threat developing toward the road pass and the valley behind was part of that picture, and it made a position that was already expensive look untenable, but the sources put the weight on accumulated attrition and on the sheer breadth of pressure Byers had generated across the whole front. Which is, if anything, a harder conclusion than a clean supply cut would have been. It means there was no single clever stroke. It means 19 days of the most concentrated artillery fire in the war, plus 3 infantry regiments, plus a corps-wide squeeze, plus casualties on a scale the defenders could not replace. All of it together was what it took to move 2 enemy regiments 3/4 of a mile, and the manner of the withdrawal tells you what the artillery had and had not achieved. An army broken by firepower does not leave an undamaged defensive system, walk to the next hill and start digging. It disintegrates, or it surrenders, or it retreats a long way. This was a formation making a rational decision, executing it competently, and reoccupying comparable ground a few hundred yards back where the pressure had not yet arrived. And here is the part of this story that I think matters most, and the reason I wanted to make this video rather than a straightforward account of a hard fight for a hill. 8 days later, the same American division attacked the next ridge north in very much the same way. The 2nd Infantry Division went at it beginning on September the 13th, 1951. The plan was frontal. Regimental attacks, up spurs, against reverse slope bunkers, preceded by bombardment, into a position built by the same engineers who had built the last one and improved by everything they had learned holding it. It went as Bloody Ridge had gone, but worse, and it went on for a month. The correspondents named it Heartbreak Ridge for the obvious reason. The ammunition consumption there gives you the real measure of what the Van Fleet Doctrine looked like with no governor on it. Across that battle, American artillery fired in the region of 400,000 rounds of 105mm ammunition, 84,000 rounds of 155mm, 13,000 rounds of 8-inch and 62,000 rounds of 76mm, alongside well over 100,000 mortar bombs. It did not work for exactly the reason it had not worked 3 miles to the south. What finally worked was a plan called Operation Touchdown. Major General Robert Young, who had taken command of the division on September 20, ordered an approach that abandoned the frontal method entirely, and the plan was drawn up by his operations officer, Major Thomas Mellon. The operation order was issued on October 2 with a target date of October 5. It widened the attack across the whole ridge system instead of feeding regiments at individual peaks. It pushed armour up the valleys on the flanks, with the 72nd Tank Battalion driving into the Mundung-Ni Valley. And to make that possible, the 2nd Engineer Combat Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Love built a tank road up a valley that did not have one, at one point blowing apart a rock barrier the North Koreans had seeded with live grenades, using 110 pounds of explosive to do it. Heartbreak Ridge fell on October the 15th, 1951. And it is at Heartbreak, not at Bloody Ridge, that the historians are willing to state the conclusion flatly. Gibby's verdict on that battle is that the successful interdiction of the North Korean flow of reinforcements determined the outcome. Cutting off the hill, rather than pulverizing it, was what did it. So the shape of the autumn of 1951 on the Eastern Front in Korea is not the shape people expect. It is not a story about American firepower solving a problem. It is a story about firepower being so abundant and so genuinely effective at everything else that it took 2 consecutive battles and the better part of 2 months for an army to establish that there was one specific problem it could not solve. The evidence was complete by September 5. The application of it did not begin until October 2. The accounting, when it was done, was grim, and in places it is still uncertain. United Nations losses at Bloody Ridge came to more than 2,700, the heaviest single share borne by the Republic of Korea 36th Regiment in the opening 10 days, with the American 2nd Infantry Division absorbing the remainder across the last fortnight, concentrated overwhelmingly in the 9th Infantry. North Korean losses are given in the American official history as an estimate of around 15,000, and I want to be precise about what that number is because it is repeated everywhere as though it were a count. It is not. It is a 2nd Division estimate produced by the methods intelligence sections used at the time, which meant extrapolating from observed fire effect, prisoner statements, and ammunition expended. The number of enemy dead actually found on the ridge when it was occupied was around 500. The gap between those 2 figures is not evidence of dishonesty. It reflects that the North Koreans evacuated their wounded and many of their dead throughout, and that nobody on the United Nations side walked over that ground while the enemy was still on it. You will also see figures circulating that are considerably higher again, or that claim virtually every defender became a casualty. Those are not supported by the official histories. The true figure is unknown and is likely to stay that way. There is an institutional postscript to the ammunition question that most accounts leave out. The rate of expenditure in Korea became a political issue in the United States. In March of 1953, after handing over the 8th Army, Van Fleet testified before a preparedness subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee that his army had suffered a serious shortage of ammunition, that units had been rationed, and that men had died as a result. The army resisted the charge and then conceded it. Under questioning, the Secretary of the Army agreed that a shortage had existed. It is one of the stranger paradoxes of the war. The army that fired more artillery ammunition per mile of front than any army in history to that point spent the same period rationing it, and its commander went before Congress to say there had never been enough. Both things were true at once. That is what the Van Fleet rate actually meant in practice. A doctrine of near unlimited expenditure running permanently up against a production and shipping pipeline that had been dismantled in 1945 and was being rebuilt while the shooting continued. The men in this story mostly disappeared quietly, which is the usual fate of people who fight limited objective battles in a war their own country would spend decades calling forgotten. Captain Edward Krzyzowski was 37 when he was killed, born in Chicago in January of 1914, and he had already fought one war before this one. His Medal of Honor was approved under General Orders No. 56 on June 12, 1952, and presented at the Pentagon on March 26 of that year by the Secretary of the Army, Frank Pace, to his widow Marcella. He is the only man who received that decoration for the fighting on Bloody Ridge. You will occasionally see a second name attached to this battle because another soldier of the 9th Infantry earned the medal on dates that read almost identically, from August 31 to September 3. His action was in 1950 near Yongsan, in an entirely different battle a year earlier. Only Krzyzowski's award belongs here. The commander of the Republic of Korea 36th Regiment, whose men took the ridge on August 25 and lost it the next night and broke 2 days after that, is barely present in the English language record at all. What the regiment did in the 10 days before it collapsed generally is not recorded in the accounts that record the collapse. Major General Clovis Byers, who commanded 10th Corps and made the decision to widen the front, went on to command 16th Corps, served as commandant of the NATO Defence College in the middle 1950s, and retired in 1959. He died in December of 1973 and is buried at Arlington. Major General Clark Ruffner, whose conviction about what firepower could accomplish without infantry was tested to destruction on this ridge, went on to command United States Army Pacific, The 2nd Armoured Division and the 3rd Army reached 4-star rank and died in 1982. Brigadier General Thomas DeShazo, the artilleryman who held command through the final days and who committed all 3 regiments to the movement that ended the battle, is a footnote. His name appears in the command reports and almost nowhere else. Lieutenant Joseph Burkett, whose radio failed in the fog, survived and returned to the anonymity of the men the Army's combat historians interviewed, wrote down, and did not follow up on. The most durable thing any of them left is not a memoir. It is the closing judgment in the official combat narrative written by a historian who had walked the ground and talked to the survivors, and who chose to end his chapter not with the word gallantry but with a flat observation about how long it takes to turn strangers into a unit. It is a strange legacy for a hill. The ridge itself settled nothing. The written record of what happened on it became a standing piece of evidence in a much longer argument inside the United States Army about whether individual replacements can be fed into a rifle company and expected to fight as one. The ground is still there, and it is worth knowing what became of it. Bloody Ridge lies north of the 38th parallel, and when the armistice was signed in July of 1953, the line settled north of it, which means the ridge ended up inside South Korea. It sits today in Yanggu County in Gangwon Province, in the controlled civilian access zone along the southern edge of the demilitarized zone. There is a war memorial hall at Yanggu and the Ulji Observatory on a peak above the Punchbowl from which visitors can look north across the border, and memorials in the sector to the United Nations troops who fought there. There is also a tunnel. On March 3, 1990, South Korean forces discovered the 4th of North Korea's infiltration tunnels driven under the demilitarized zone in this sector, in these mountains, running to within roughly a mile of the demarcation line on the southern side. Nearly 40 years of ceasefire in the same hills, and the war was still being prosecuted underground by an army that had learned in 1951 that underground was where it could not be reached. Since May of 2021, part of that ground has been a walking route, the first designated national forest trail in the country, running along the rim of the Punchbowl through terrain that was fought over for the better part of 2 months and has been largely left alone ever since. And the arm that dominated that autumn still dominates the peninsula. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, North Korea today fields more than 8,600 towed and self-propelled artillery pieces, around 5,500 multiple rocket launcher systems, and roughly 7,500 mortars. The strategic logic has not changed since 1951. Artillery is the arm North Korea can afford, can conceal, can dig in, and can maintain without the industrial base needed to compete in aircraft or armour. On August 27, 2024, Kim Jong-un attended the test firing of an upgraded 240mm multiple rocket launcher, which state media reported the following day, describing it as carrying a newly applied guiding system and as advantageous in controllability and destructive power. The most striking modern demonstration of what that stockpile represents came not on the peninsula, but in Europe. Analysis published by the Open Source Centre on April 15, 2025, tracked 64 shipping voyages between September of 2023 and March of 2024-3 and March of 2025, carrying over 15,000 containers, and estimated on a conservative basis that North Korea had transferred to Russia between 4 and 6 million artillery rounds for use in Ukraine. Ukrainian military intelligence put the effect more bluntly, stating that without North Korean help, Russian shelling of Ukrainian defensive positions would have been cut in half. Whether that arsenal means what it is usually said to mean is now genuinely contested. The standard claim, repeated for decades, is that North Korean artillery could inflict hundreds of thousands of casualties on Seoul in the opening hours of a war. In the summer of 2025, Nicholas Anderson and Darrell Press published an assessment in the Texas National Security Review, arguing that the threat has been dramatically overstated, that only a fraction of the artillery park can physically reach the city, and that plausible losses in Seoul would be 1 to 2 orders of magnitude lower than the common estimates, running to a few thousand rather than a few 100,000. Which is, in its way, the same argument as Bloody Ridge, conducted 75 years later with better mathematics. An enormous quantity of artillery aimed at a target harder to destroy than the quantity suggests, and a persistent assumption that volume of fire and military effect are the same thing. They were not the same thing in 1951, and there is no particular reason to believe they have become the same thing since. The hill did not fall to the guns. That is the whole of it. For 19 days, the most materially powerful army in the world attacked a ridge from the front, with more explosive than any army had ever put onto a piece of ground that size, against men who had built their entire defensive system on the assumption that this was precisely what would happen, and who were proved right for 19 days running. The position was given up in the end because a corps commander squeezed an entire front instead of one hill, because a division finally committed everything it had to going around both ends rather than up the middle, and because the men in the bunkers had been losing soldiers they had no way of replacing since the middle of August. And then the division walked 3/4 of a mile north and began again, and spent a month and several 100,000 shells arriving at a conclusion it had already bought and paid for once. If you want to know why the line across Korea sits where it does, and why both armies facing each other across it still measure their strength in tubes and shells, the answer is somewhere in those two ridges and the fortnight between them. The weapons on that border are new. The question underneath them is the one a lieutenant with a dead radio was trying to answer on a foggy morning at the end of August 1951 on a hill that no amount of steel could take.